Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Now, ever since Bharatiya Janata Party, which is led by its Prime Minister Narendra Modi, took over power in India, things have become difficult for so many. Especially when we talk about Muslims, there's been a rise in Islamophobia, and there's been rampant and brutal discrimination that has been focused towards Muslim minority within India. Not only Muslims, but also the other communities, including the Sikhs, Christians and Dalits have also faced brutal and rampant discrimination. Now, when we specifically talk about the northeastern state of Manipur, now, owing to Hindutva-driven policies of the Bharatiya Janata Party government and also the biased role of judiciary over there, clashes have erupted since May the 3rd, which have worsened over time, and as per some media reports, it has claimed over 70 lives. And now, just ahead of the visit of the Indian Home Minister Amit Shah to this particular violence-stricken state, the Chief Minister of the state has said that the Indian Army, paramilitary and other law enforcement agencies which have been deployed in the state in huge numbers have been able to kill 40 insurgents that primarily belong to the Kuki community over there. And these clashes have erupted between this particular Kuki community, which are largely Christians, and also the Mitai community, which are largely Hindus over there. Now, when we talk about Indian Army Chief, he had also a two-day visit to the state. Now, Indian Home Minister is also visiting this particular state. Many organizations have blamed Hindutva for this violence and bloodshed in the state. And they have also feared that if the situation is not controlled properly, this might lead to a civil war. We will also be talking about Indian Prime Minister who had recently had a visit to Australia, had interactions with the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Anthony Albanese. As they were having interactions, ironically so, we saw a BBC documentary which established the role of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the deadly Gujarat massacre of 2002 that led to the killing of thousands of Muslims in particular at that time, was screened in the Australian Parliament. A panel discussion was also held regarding that particular documentary, and many participants of that panel discussion saying that watching Australian Prime Minister interacting with Indian Prime Minister where he failed to raise the human rights situation within India was a disappointment. Now, let me quickly bring in our panelists. We are honored to have been joined in the studio by Air Vice Marshal, retired Ijaz Malik, his senior analyst. Mr. Malik, thank you very much for joining us at Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. At the same time, on Skype from Washington, D.C., we are being joined by Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali, expert in international relations. Mr. Ali, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Malik. Whom do you think is responsible, whatever is happening, specifically when we talk about since May the 3rd in Manipur state?
Definitely, it is the Union Government of India, which is led by Mr. Modi and his fascist regime, who are responsible for this. And as you have mentioned in your intro, they have actually not only issued or done certain administrative arrangement by taking over the control of the province by the federation or the union, they have also somehow been able to manage a verdict from the court which actually paved the way for all this violence. And out of the population of around 3.5 million, there were around 60,000 protestants who came out in street to protest against that bill, which ultimately was perceived as a bridgehead to implant and enforce the demographic and the socio-economic fabric of this state. Because that bill will give a particular status to the Hindus who are otherwise in majority, but as per the existing rules and regulations, they cannot go and purchase land in the areas which are currently under Kukis and Nagas, who are around 40% of the population, and the other being in around 53% of population. So if it is allowed and it's implemented, not only that they will be deprived of a land which predominantly is populated by them and which is this main source of livelihood for them, they would have special status to have special access to education, job opportunities. So ultimately these 40% would be marginalized in the broader context of the socio-economic landscape of the state.
Right, I'll come back to this particular point to take your detailed view regarding this 40% being marginalized. Is it a sinister design? Is it a particularly focused campaign on the part of the authorities? I'll come to this particular point later in the show. Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali, what's your understanding of the situation, whatever is happening in the Manipur state? Whom do you think is responsible for so many killings that have happened over the weeks since the clashes have erupted?
So my apologies, my line dropped. So I'm, my comments, I might reiterate some of what was said. But I think
please
that,
go ahead.
If one takes a long view of this issue. Right. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead. Mr. Ali, please go ahead.
Okay, so well, if one takes a long view on this situation, I mean, this is an outcome of divide and rule policies, because this was again one of those princely states. It's not only Manipur, it's Mizoram, it's Assam, these northeastern states, which are very important. Now with the great game unfolding, I mean, their proximity to Southeast Asia, proximity to Central Asia. So there is that broader sort of context, historical and geostrategic context. And then, of course, within that context, we have the situation on the ground. And the situation on the ground is such that, there are diverse communities, ethnic communities, tribal communities, the Kuki, the Mighty and the Nagas and the Kukis are Christian, and have had these accommodations in sort of the Indian constitution being scheduled castes. And now you have a situation where the Hindus, who have also been quite marginalized, are also trying to get accommodation with sort of the Hindutva narrative in particular, and that's sort of sparked this unrest within the state. But the insurgency has been lingering for decades, within this state and within its adjoining states in the northeast.
Right, Mr. Ali, as you mentioned that this particular thing has been simmering over. When we specifically talk about the anger, the kind of resentment within the marginalized communities over there, when we specifically talk about Manipur, the Kuki community over there, as you already mentioned, it's been going on over for decades now. Could you shed a little bit of more light on the origins of this particular resentment and anger? What sort of discrimination this particular community has faced over the years?
So some of this has to do with the economic model that India has been using since particularly the 1990s, this idea of shining India, right? And this economic model is basically the neoliberal economic model. It's the model that Pakistan follows. It's a model that the IMF and World Bank have been propagating for decades. India sort of joined the game a bit late in the early 1990s, and then we saw the rise of the BJP. So it's a typical top-down model, in the same way that one has noticed the economic disparities that this kind of a model has created in many other sort of developing countries around the world. It has created, similar problems between the indigenous, between the tribals, and and the Indian state, which they view as appropriating the assets of the state. I mean, there's a story that resonates in many other countries as well. So it's, within that broader context of an elite, top-down, extractive model, post-colonial economic model. And then, then within the communities, it exacerbates along the lines of ethnicity and religion. Then we see, a sort of within that context of scarce resources and whatever accommodation the Indian state can provide via the scheduled status, we see a fight then within these communities. I mean, to just to show you sort of how this problem mutates. I mean, if you look at adjoining Assam, for instance, now in Assam, you also have Ulfa, you have a long-standing insurgent movement. And the Assamese also feel that they are being inundated by the other, right? By other ethnic groups. And there, I mean, in particular, the Bengalis, around the 1971 war and thereafter, the Bengalis have been coming and they feel that they're being flooded by the Bengalis. So here the fear is and the tension is between the Kukis and the Nagas and the Mighty who've all actually been there for a while. And there it's with the Bengali Hindus and the Bengali Muslims. So so these are sort of the factors, sort of this ethnic friction, which then of course goes back to hastily drawn national borders, the way in which this princely state had acceded to the Indian state, but was not provided enough accommodation, and has subsequently regretted, being a part of India.
Right. Let me proceed with this discussion. Mr. Malik, you already mentioned, we all know that Matai community happens to be in majority over there in the state. What basically is the scheduled tribe, and why does a majority of that particular state wants to be included in that list?
Actually, this special constitutional status is given to communities which are considered socially or economically backward or marginalized in a particular state or in a group of states. Here the argument which has convinced the court, that is that because although this group is in majority as far as their population is concerned, but they are confined to a limited land, which is per se the area in the valley where there are relatively better educational facilities available, and day-to-day living is comparatively better as compared to the areas which is populated by the tribal groups of the remaining 40%. So their argument is that although we have the majority in population, but we do not own or we do not have access to the resources of a major portion of the land. So we should be considered on those lines where we are enabled to grow ourselves outward within the same state. While on the other side, the population wise minority or the second group, which are Kukis and Nagas, they think, and rightly so, that they will be deprived of their livelihood.
So when we talk about the first argument that you just mentioned, yes, that was laid before the court, and it's a verdict that buys that particular argument, do you think it is justified? What's your understanding and analysis?
No, it's not justified. You just imagine, I would like to draw certain similarities and comparison with the state of with the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Just like that, it was a princely state. They joined Indian Union in 1949, and what has happened to the Muslims in Indian occupied Kashmir. So same fate is being meted out to these tribal people, the Kukis and Nagas in the state of Manipur. And secondly, the federation or the Indian Union taking control through massive military deployment in Kashmir. Similarly over here, for a small population size, almost half of which is pro-Hindutva. So for the remaining one half or the 40% population, they have done massive deployments.
Let me take Mr. Ali's view on this particular point, the argument which has been put forth before the court. Mr. Ali, what's your understanding? The argument which has been mentioned by Mr. Malik just a short while ago, do you think it's justified on the premise of which the verdict of the Manipur Supreme Court came in?
I, I do agree, and I was trying to, as I was trying to say earlier, that this is a larger problem, right? I mean, and within the Indian context, we see this majoritarianism that comes to the fore, with Hindutva. I mean, in our own country, we see it with the hegemony of the Punjab and the problems with the other provinces, which are obvious. But this is not only a problem for Manipur. I mean, if you look at the Naxalite corridor, Kashmir has a special status, and with this being a disputed territory, I think the contours of that are slightly different. But yes, there is this fear now, right? I mean, with this kind of with having the G20 summit, for instance, in Indian held Kashmir. And this idea of bringing in investment, of bringing in development, but sidelining the local populace at the same time, right? And this is a problem that also exists in, Arundhati Roy, for instance, keeps talking about this internationally, and of course many other scholars and journalists. The Naxalite corridor also has the same problem. The Maoists, I mean, they've adopted an extremist sort of leftist ideology and taken up arms, but they have met with extreme repression, by the Indian state, and it's again a fight essentially over resources, right? And how the Indian state has been sort of this, that's what's meant by this elitist model, right? Of pushing people off the land, of denying them of resources, of denying them a share of resources in the name of top-down economic growth. And it does also align with the Hindutva, ideology, and perhaps I can speak to that in my next comment.
Very quickly, what sort of an impact if the authorities go by this particular verdict and they try to include this particular Matai community in the scheduled tribe list? What sort of an impact it's going to have on the other communities, specifically talking about the Kuki community, which are protesting against this?
Well, I personally, because because the scheduled caste, I mean, it was supposed to be this idea of accommodation, right? And trying to bring them to, to help them with this historical denial. So there are even, with the mighty, there has been deprivation, but when you have a limited amount of resources, and the state is unwilling to change the basic structure of how it does development, then you have an extremely small pot of resources, and then you will have different communities fighting over that very small pot of resources, right? So I mean, the fear for the Naga and the Kuki is that there's not enough to go around, and now if you also provide accommodation to these, and many of them they are Hindus, but they have been living in this area also for generations, and many of them are also marginalized. So if they are also to get quotas, but if you have a very small quota, then they don't want, these two other communities don't want also this community to also have to share it. So I think that is more of a problem, because the larger top-down model is not being challenged, right? I mean, it's not about providing more resources generally to Manipur. So that is why it's creating this kind of divisiveness on the ground.
Ali, we are joined by another participant on the phone line, Mr. Irfan Ghauri, senior journalist. Mr. Ghauri, thank you very much for joining in at Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Whatever is happening in Manipur, state of India, whom do you think is responsible for the kind of violence and bloodshed that we have seen over the number of weeks now?
Thank you very much. In Manipur, when we talk about, the situation over there, we should know that Manipur is amongst the states where there has been tension, and even there has been a movement of separation from India. It's a long history since this state joined India in 1949, and few decades after that, this has been going on over there. So when we analyze the situation over there, right now we are more focused on sort of steroids that have been going on over there, but it has deep-rooted other issues as well. It is not only the issue of the recent court decision where they have granted the marginalized community rights to the majority community over there, which is of course Hindus there.
What do you think? Is it justified to grant a certain majority that particular status, the scheduled tribe list status, to a majority? Is it justified?
Of course, this is their court decision, but as a result of that, what we have seen is that the minority communities over there, who are mainly the Christians, and even there are some, you would be surprised that even there are some Jewish communities living over there. They have also been badly targeted because they already had the reservations that the majority over there, which is Meitei community, they are mostly Hindus. They were comparatively more prosperous. They were living in the urban valley areas, and once this majority community, they would be given the marginalized rights, that would erode the prospect of having those quotas and in jobs not only, but also they would be given rights to own the lands in the hilly areas, which those minority communities, the Christians and the others, they see a threat to their existence over there.
Right, Mr. Ghauri, do you think it's a sinister and a nefarious and a well thought out plan on the part of the Indian authorities led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi? We haven't seen any sort of a statement coming from Indian Prime Minister himself regarding the violence and the kind of scale and the proportion that we have seen over the weeks. And do you think this is a specifically well thought out design to eliminate that very identity of the Christians in this particular state?
If I won't say that it is a well thought out plan, but it is a fact that since the BJP led by Narendra Modi, they came to power in 2014. What we have seen is that the minority communities, be it the Muslims, mainly the Muslims and then the Christians and others, they have seen violence and suppression of unprecedented scale. You know the situation of Muslims over there. Even the Western thinkers, they now call that as a systematic genocide of Muslims and these other communities. I mean the Christians and others. So in case of Manipur. And you should know that in Manipur is the state run by BJP. So if we say that, this violence that we hold responsible any other, when there is a communal issues as well, but being in government, in center and over there, what we have seen so far is that they have not been able to control the situation despite having a very massive military presence already in that state.
Mr. Irfan Ghauri, senior journalist, thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight, joining us on phone line. We really appreciate your time. Mr. Malik, high-handedness of Indian Army, the paramilitary forces, other law enforcement agencies, on the pretext of controlling the violence and the bloodshed and the kind of communal violence we have seen over the years, they've specifically targeted the Christians. Now, just ahead of Amit Shah's visit to this particular state, the Chief Minister of the state says the 40 people who've been killed are insurgents. Your take?
Yes, this is a combined effort on the part of the state machinery, the Federation, the Indian Union, their judiciary as well as their even parliament, because in the parliament they have 60 seats and 39 are with the BJP MLAs. So they all agree that they have to implement the Hindutva agenda in this particular state. And I think they find this a ripe time to pursue their objectives, because right now through a very well orchestrated foreign policy and media management and their economic collaborations and cooperation with the rest of the world led by America and Europe, they are taking advantage of this time to do whatever they want to do. One of the Indian origin PhD scholar, he very rightly mentioned in his paper, I would like to quote, that he said that in India fascism is reinventing itself in the form of Indian nationalism and Hindutva. And where do they draw their inspiration and roots? It is from the Nazism, the German Nazism. There, the main, the person who in 1938 gave the idea of RSS, and he was a proponent of use of violence against anybody and everybody who is not from the mainstream religion or the ethnicity. And he said that at that time, he said, Mr. Sarwarkar, he said that India should handle Muslims the way Jewish were handled by Nazis in Germany. So that is the kind of doctrines they are following. So we should not expect from them that any sanity would prevail, because this is their high-handedness.
So, Mr. Malik, where are the things heading in this particular state when we see the Supreme Court of the state giving a verdict in the favor of the majority over there? There's been resentment and protest against that verdict, and then happens to be a tension between the communities over there. Now, the Indian government comes in with large military deployment over there. The Chief Minister saying the people who've been killed are terrorists. Now, don't you think it's going to flare up the situation rather than the situation is going to be brought under control with this kind of high-handedness? And this particular strategy is going to blow in the face of Indian administration, and it could also lead into a civil war. There are so many organizations and bodies which are fearing that this particular situation, if not controlled, it might worsen, it might lead to a civil war. For example, the chief executive of Open Doors UK and Ireland said the Hindu extremists have used the communal violence as a platform to further attack the Christian community.
Yes, while the ahead of Amit Shah's visit, the Chief Minister, Mr. Byron Singh, he gives a statement that it was a small insurgency and it has been controlled. So, he's giving a message of all is well, where the situation on ground doesn't suggest, it suggests otherwise. So, I see a lot of violence in case they continue, which I'm sure they will continue, because the history, as I said, as we just draw a comparison with Indian illegally occupied Kashmir, exactly the same thing. They in Kashmir, they declare anybody, they pull out anybody from his house or from his place of work and shoot him publicly, and then say that it was an encounter with the terrorist. So this similarity, same thing is happening over here. So has it been controlled in Kashmir? Obviously not. So now it was a simmering fault line for almost 3 to 4 decades. Now the violence has been introduced over there. So this generation and the next generation, probably they will have more resistance, and because they are now seeing the real face of the Indian Union, the so-called secular democracy.
Right. Mr. Ali, what's your understanding of the situation? Where do you think the situation is heading towards? Do you think a civil war is inevitable if the strategy of the Indian authorities goes wrong?
No, I do not think that we're looking at a civil war in this region in particular. I mean, it's a very small state. There are, I think, the local conflict dynamics do spill over the state borders. So Nagaland, Mizoram, Manipur and Assam are nearby. Kashmir is nowhere, near these states. So, and the Indian state, unfortunately, right now, I mean, in global politics and economically, I mean, it is a overdeveloped and a strong state with international backing. So, in its ability to handle conflict in a ham-handed manner without addressing, the real causes, I mean, that is what it's gunning for. And I don't, even if there is violence and there might be brutal suppression, but I personally don't think that there are chances of a civil war.
You've seen, according to some media reports, there are hundreds of churches which have been burnt. So it's a categorical and a clear desecration of the places of worship for a certain religious community. What it might lead to, we have seen in the recent past twice the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom also highlighting the gross human rights violations towards certain religious minorities going on within India, and it also urged the State Department to include India in the list of countries of particular concern, which the State Department didn't do. But most recently, we have seen the second time this commission has also highlighted this particular issue. Your understanding regarding this?
Yes, absolutely. Since the last few years, a lot of human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, US SURF, which is a government-mandated American, Commission on International Religious Freedom, has been asking the State Department to declare India, like Saudi, like China, like Russia, like Pakistan, as a country of particular concern. And they have been refusing to do so, despite, the citizenship law, despite what's been happening in Kashmir, despite what then happened when President Trump had gone to India and the riots which were occurring. So, so yes, there is this majoritarianism, but again, I wanna sort of point out, since I teach courses here on South Asia, and I'd like to sort of see similarities. I'd also wanted to point out, that this majoritarianism, so forget populism in Europe or elsewhere, but even if you look at South Asia, so look at, what happened in Sri Lanka with the Tamils and the Sinhalese. Now, earlier you were saying something about sort of, a majority and a majority being provided accommodation. That is exactly what had happened, with the Sinhalese when they became an independent state. And that was a reaction to divide and rule policies of the British, because what the British had done was they'd taken a minority Tamil population, which was Hindu and educated, and used them to rule over the majority. When the majority's frustration had been building up, and after independence, they overcompensated and thought of the minority as the enemy, right? And, that eventually they did not recognize their language. They were language riots, similar to what happened with Bangla, I mean, on our side. And then, you had a civil war. And even unfortunately, after the civil war, the Sinhalese state has continued to, use a very oppressive post-conflict, reconstruction model in Sri Lanka, and that tension still does.
What should, I seek your pardon for the interjection over here, what should ideally be the position of the US State Department regarding this particular mention of India in particular by the US Commission on International Religious Freedom?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what a lot of people have been saying, that it needs to, because if it doesn't, I mean, as it is, there are lots of issues with Islamophobia, etc., in countries like the US, and issues with race. But, I mean, because it's such a powerful country, when it designates countries as countries of particular concern, it does something to their reputation. And because it is not putting India on that list, then what it allows other countries to do is say that this is rubbish. This is a biased list. Why are we on it? You know, despite what we are doing to our minorities, why are we on it and India's not on it? So certainly, of course, the US should put India on that list as well. And that pressure, I think, is growing, and there is increasing discomfort, internationally on sort of, on India's human rights record, on sort of, this reliance on the Hindutva, this majoritarian rule. But this is what other states in the region do also too.
Right. Mr. Malik, when we talk about specifically about the places of religious worship, over 300 churches have been burnt. What does it mean to a certain community when their places of worship are being burnt?
I think this is one of the worst kind of state brutality towards its own public and its own populace, because this is religious worship, and the religious places, be it temples, masjid, or any other place of worship, including churches, it symbolizes the cultural, social heritage, and people relate to such iconic buildings, even if it is a small church in a rural area or in a backward area or remote area. So if their church is not safe, how would they think that they are safe and the state is their custodian, or state is supposed to which is supposed to look after them, is doing its responsibility well. So I think it has a lot of symbolic and emotional value for people. So again, it will add to fuel to the fire.
So talking about the US Commission of International Religious Freedom, twice it has highlighted the kind of gross human rights violations towards religious minorities within India, yet the State Department doesn't include India in the list of the countries of particular concern. What does that primarily depict?
Actually, it is in the larger context of how they see their strategic partnership
despite
with India.
A BBC documentary out also?
Yes,
which has been
there is a BBC documentary.
Even in Washington, D.C.
There is a CNN program on Manipur. There is DW program. There is a notice taken by the UN High Commission for Human Rights on this. These all things are there. But the policymaker in the US government or US administration, they view India and with the, kind of their custodian of their policies in this region, and the counterbalance to the Chinese and the new look east mantra, which is taking roots very fast in this region. So that is why they are just keeping their eyes closed towards whatever India does. And I think as wicked as they are,
not everybody in the Western world is keeping their eyes shut. We have seen there was a screening of this BBC documentary that established the role of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the Gujarat massacre of 2002, and the participants of the panel discussion after the screening, and most surprisingly, that was screened while at the same time both the Prime Ministers, the Australian Prime Minister and Indian Prime Minister, were having interactions. So, I mean, the panelists were from the parliament also. There were senators also in the panel discussion, and they said the interactions between the two prime ministers, where Australian Prime Minister was unable, or he failed to raise the human rights situation with his Indian counterpart, was a disappointment.
Yes, because this shows their double standards of handling selectively different regions and different issues at different stages of history. And if you go through the Indian American policies, they have been maintaining such.
So what sort of a welcome this is? On the face of it, we saw that the two prime ministers having interaction, Australian Prime Minister and Indian Prime Minister having interaction. At the same time, a documentary which was banned by Indian authorities, not only within India, the banning of its screening within universities in India, also on the social media platforms, that was being screened at the very same time within the Australian Parliament. What does that mean?
I think we should appreciate that they at least have a semblance of the basic freedoms of expression and you know, to talk about what is right and what is wrong. But the issue is not that how was it screened and when was it screened. The issue is, if you just go back on the same issue of Mr. Modi's involvement in the carnage in state of Gujarat, he was debarred from entry into the United States. Those realities were never changed, the verdicts were never changed, but still the status of him, from, you know, how and what a grand welcome he was given by the then US administration. So you know, double standards, I would say, nothing else.
Right, Mr. Ali, what's your understanding of this particular screening of a BBC documentary establishing the role of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Gujarat massacre of 2002 at the very same time when Indian Prime Minister and Australian Prime Minister both were having interactions?
Yes, I mean, there is that criticism, and that was a big thing, the BBC documentary. Not only that, Gregory Stanton, who is, you know, he heads this thing called Genocide Watch, and he had, you know, he had foretold the Rwandan genocide, right? So he last year, you know, urged Congress, the American Congress, the US Congress, to issue a warning on, you know, on the possibility of genocide within India. So, you know, it's not that no one is taking notice, but yes, there is this broader sort of, you know, strategic concern, which is, you know, I mean, morality, as they, you know, some people say, is often used as a cudgel, right? So it becomes a way of admonishing. So you recognize some things, you know, and you don't recognize others in international relations. So, you know, and behind it are realpolitik considerations often.
What about the timing? Well, both the prime ministers were having interaction. Mr. Modi was having a tour to Australia. At the same time, in the Australian Parliament, that particular documentary, which is being banned by Indian authorities within India, its universities, also the social media platforms, including YouTube and Twitter. So when Indian Prime Minister is there physically, having interactions with his Australian counterpart, at the same very time, this particular documentary is being screened in the Australian Parliament. What about the timing, or what does it depict?
Well, it does. It makes things more uncomfortable, right? I mean, because, but you know, this is not the only factor. I mean, so if you look at Modi's persona non grata status, he was subsequently by the Indian judiciary exonerated. But yes, then I mean, a red carpet was, you know, was rolled out for him in Washington D.C. And the very strong Indian lobby here was quite instrumental in making that happen. And of course, you know, when he became the prime minister, then you know, then earlier in fact, his own ability to influence the Indian judiciary, the Indian media. I mean, that's what strong authoritarian governments do, right? They co-opt the checks and balances within the state. So, you know, so while that's happening internally, externally, you know, even states, when they are doing their realpolitik calculus, will, you know, will operate, they'll walk and chew gum at the same time. So yes, I mean, you know, there is value in noticing that these things are happening, you know, but in the same way that President Trump went to India, you know, and there were major riots going on, and the police was being, you know, very fierce, you know, in clamping down on, particularly on Muslim students post the Citizen Amendment Act. So it makes, you know, it makes for sensationalism, and you know, I mean, when it's picked up by the media, when it's not, I mean, it shows how the media is being muffled, and it makes things more uncomfortable. So India being the largest democracy, right? I mean, you had the summit of democracy, you had Mr. Netanyahu. And
Your point is well taken. Unfortunately, we're short of time. I'll have to cut the show over here right now. Joining us on Skype from Washington, D.C., Syed Muhammad Ali, expert in international relations. Thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight. I really appreciate that. In the studio, we were joined by Mr. Air Vice Marshal Retired Ijaz Malik, Senior Analyst. Mr. Malik, thank you very much for your time also once again for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. It was indeed an enlightening discussion. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.